There's an island in the Canadian Arctic that you're not allowed to visit, not because it is dangerous in the conventional sense, not because the weather makes it inaccessible, though the weather there would kill you in hours if you were unprepared, not because it sits in some disputed international boundary zone where lawyers and diplomats are still arguing over who owns the frozen ground beneath your feet. You are not allowed to visit this island because the Canadian government decided in 1952 that whatever was happening, there was not something the public needed to know about. And in the more than 7 decades that have passed since that decision was made, no administration, no parliament, no freedom of information request, and no investigative journalist has managed to fully reverse it. The island sits in Hudson Bay, roughly equidistant between the northern coast of Quebec and the western coast of Baffin Island. It is large enough to matter. It is remote enough to hide things. And it has been hiding things, according to the fragments of declassified documents that researchers have spent decades piecing together since at least the late 1940s. What those things are, exactly, is where the story gets complicated, because the Canadian government has never given a single coherent explanation for why Akamiski Island and the broader restricted zone that surrounds it has remained off limits to civilians for longer than most people alive today have been breathing. What we do know from documents obtained through access to information requests, from the testimonies of Inuit elders who were removed from lands adjacent to the restricted zones, from military historians who have spent careers studying the Cold War's frozen northern theater, and from the handful of journalists who have gotten closer to the truth than the government was comfortable with, is that the story of this island is not a simple story. It is not the story of one event, one decision, one moment in which someone in Ottawa said, "Seal it off," and never let anyone back. It is a story of decades of decisions, each one building on the last, each one adding another layer to a wall of secrecy that has never been fully dismantled. It is a story about the Cold War, about sovereignty, about what governments do when they believe the ends justify whatever means are necessary, and about the people who paid the price for those decisions without ever being asked whether they consented to pay it. If you want to understand why this island matters, you have to understand what the Arctic meant to Canada in 1952. You have to understand what it meant to the United States. You have to understand what it meant to the Soviet Union, whose long-range bombers could reach North American targets by flying over the polar ice cap, cutting through Canadian airspace along routes that made the Arctic not a frozen wilderness at the edge of the map, but the most strategically critical piece of real estate on Earth. When you understand all of that, the decision to restrict the island starts to make a certain kind of terrible sense. What does not make sense? What has never made sense? What researchers and historians and the descendants of the people who were removed from those lands have been demanding answers about for decades is why the restriction is still in place. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The bombers that made the Arctic into a military theater were retired or redeployed, and yet the island remains closed. The files remain sealed or heavily redacted. The official explanations remain vague to the point of meaninglessness, and no civilian in the entire recorded history of the restriction has ever been permitted to return and stay. If you find this channel valuable and you want to keep getting deep dives like this one, subscribe right now. Hit the bell so you do not miss what is coming next. This one took months of research across declassified archives, access to information disclosures, and accounts from the communities most directly affected by what happened up there. Let's get into it. To really understand the weight of what we are talking about, you need to hold 2 images in your mind at the same time. The first image is of Akamiski Island as it exists in satellite photographs and the few aerial surveys that have been made public. It is a flat, low-lying island roughly 4,000 square kilometers of tundra and wetland and rocky shore. In summer, parts of it turn a surprising green, and the shorelines fill with migratory birds in numbers that make ornithologists genuinely emotional. Polar bears den there. Beluga whales move through the surrounding waters. Before the restriction, the island and its surrounding waters were used seasonally by Cree and other indigenous communities who had known those lands for generations without needing to own them in any legal sense, because ownership in the Western legal sense was not a concept that had ever applied there until Europeans decided it should. The second image you need to hold is of a map of the Arctic as it looked to a military strategist in Washington or Ottawa in 1951. On that map, the Arctic Ocean is not a wilderness. It is a highway. Soviet Tu-4 bombers, reverse-engineered copies of American B-29s that the Soviets had obtained after the Second World War, had a range that allowed them to fly over the North Pole and strike targets in the northern United States and Canada. The only early warning systems that existed in the early 1950s were clustered in the south, oriented toward threats coming across the Atlantic or Pacific, designed for a world in which the polar route was still a theoretical concern, rather than an operational reality. By 1949, the Soviet Union had successfully tested an atomic bomb. By 1951, American military planners were operating under the assumption that a Soviet strike on North American targets was not a question of whether, but when. The Arctic was no longer the edge of the world. It was the front line. What happened in the decade between 1945 and 1955 in the Canadian Arctic was one of the most intense, most secretive, and most consequential military buildups in Canadian history. Radar stations were constructed on islands and coastal promontories across the north, each one part of a chain designed to give enough warning of an incoming Soviet attack to allow interceptors to scramble and missiles to be readied. Weather stations, which were in many cases dual-purpose operations serving both scientific and intelligence functions, were established at points across the Arctic archipelago. Supply routes were mapped and tested. Airstrips were carved out of permafrost at locations that did not appear on any civilian map, and in a number of locations whose exact identities remain partially obscured by ongoing classification, experiments were conducted. Tests were run. Operations were carried out that the Canadian government has never fully explained and has, in several cases, actively worked to suppress. Akamiski Island, sitting in the southwestern corner of Hudson Bay, was one of those locations. Why this particular island became significant to the operations that were being planned and executed in the early Cold War years is something researchers have pieced together from multiple fragmentary sources, none of them complete, all of them raising more questions than they answer. Part of the answer is geography. The island's position in Hudson Bay gave it strategic value as a potential forward operating location, a place from which surveillance of the bay's waters and the approaches to the major rivers that drain into it could be conducted without being obvious about it. Part of the answer is the island's existing infrastructure, such as it was. There had been a Hudson's Bay Company trading post in the region, and the roots and relationships established through that trade meant that the island was not entirely unknown to southern Canadian institutions. And part of the answer, the part that the documentary record most strongly supports, and that community testimonies most powerfully confirm, is that the island's existing population, the Omushkego Cree, who used it seasonally, and the small number of people who lived in its vicinity more permanently, was small enough that removing them, or moving them, or making their continued presence there incompatible with whatever was being planned, was logistically manageable. That last part is the part that haunts the history of this island, because what the documents show, in the careful, bureaucratic language that governments use when they are doing things they know will look bad later, is that the 1952 restriction order was not simply a military necessity imposed on an empty landscape. It was imposed on a landscape that was not empty. There were people there, and what happened to those people, what was done to them, and what was taken from them under the cover of national security and the Cold War emergency, is a story that Canada has never fully reckoned with. The restriction order itself, the actual document that created the formal legal basis for the exclusion zone around Akamiski Island and the surrounding waters, was issued in the summer of 1952. It was signed by officials in the Department of National Defense and countersigned by representatives of the Department of Northern Affairs, which at the time was the branch of the federal government nominally responsible for the welfare of Indigenous peoples in the North, a responsibility it discharged with a consistency that has been described by historians as, at best, negligent, and at worst, deliberately cruel. The order cited national security concerns. It referenced ongoing operations of a classified nature. It specified that access to the island and a defined surrounding zone would require authorization from the Department of National Defense, and that authorization would not be granted except in circumstances approved by the department itself. It did not explain what the operations were. It did not specify when the restriction might be lifted. It did not include any provision for the communities who had been using those lands and waters for generations. In the years immediately following the order, access to information about what was actually happening on the island was essentially impossible for anyone outside a very small circle of military and government officials. Canada, in the early 1950s, did not have freedom of information legislation. The Official Secrets Act provided broad authority to classify and suppress information that the government deemed sensitive, and the culture of the time, both within government and in the broader Canadian public, was not one that encouraged aggressive questioning of national security decisions. The Cold War was not an abstraction. The fear of Soviet attack was real and widely shared. When the government said that something was necessary for national security, most Canadians accepted that claim without demanding evidence. That acceptance had consequences that would not become apparent for decades. While the public accepted the restriction as an unfortunate but necessary Cold War measure, a very different story was unfolding on the ground, in the communities adjacent to the restricted zone, among the people who had been displaced or whose access to traditional lands and resources had been severed by a government order they had no voice in creating and no legal mechanism to challenge. Those communities carried that story forward in memory and testimony when the documents were locked away, and it is partly through their accounts, painstakingly collected by Indigenous rights organizations, by academic researchers, and by journalists willing to work in archives that the government would have preferred stayed dusty and undisturbed, that the fuller picture of what the 1952 restriction actually meant has gradually emerged. But before we get to what happened after the restriction, we need to understand what the island was before it became a secret. Because the history of Akamiski Island before 1952 is not the history of an empty or insignificant place. It is the history of a landscape that supported human life and human culture for thousands of years, that was mapped and charted and fought over by European colonial powers, that was incorporated into the economic systems of the fur trade and the whaling industry, and that existed on the eve of the Cold War as a place with living communities, living relationships to the land, and living traditions that the restriction order would spend the next 7 decades slowly, methodically erasing from the official record. The earliest confirmed human presence in the Hudson Bay region dates back approximately 4,000 years to the Dorset culture, a pre-Inuit Arctic people who left behind tool assemblages and campsites across the islands and coastal areas of the bay. The Dorset people were eventually replaced, or absorbed by the Thule, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, who arrived in the Hudson Bay area roughly 1,000 years ago, and whose descendants were still living in and around the bay's islands when European explorers first arrived in the 16th century. In the southwestern portion of the bay, where Akamiski Island sits, the cultural and territorial picture was complicated by the presence of Cree peoples, specifically the Omushkigo Cree, also known as the Swampy Cree, whose territory extended from the boreal forest to the north and west into the subarctic and across to the shores of Hudson Bay. The boundary between Cree and Inuit territories in the Hudson Bay region was not a fixed line, but a zone of interaction, trade, and occasional conflict that shifted over time and that neither group defined in the exclusive territorial terms that European legal systems later imposed. For the Omushkigo Cree, Akamiski Island was not a permanent settlement, but a seasonal resource. The island's position in the bay made it a productive location for hunting, particularly for the beluga whales that moved through the surrounding waters in significant numbers during the summer months. The coastal wetlands supported large populations of waterfowl. The tidal flats were rich in shellfish and other marine resources. The interior of the island, while not particularly productive for terrestrial hunting, offered some grazing for caribou. During certain seasons, communities from the mainland would travel to the island in summer, harvest its resources, and return before the weather made travel too dangerous. This pattern of seasonal use was not incidental or casual. It was embedded in the ecological knowledge, the spiritual practices, and the social structures of the communities that maintained it. The island was a named place in their geography, a significant place in their oral traditions, a place with a history and a meaning that existed entirely outside the framework of the maps that European explorers were drawing. Those European explorers began arriving in the Hudson Bay area in the late 16th century. Henry Hudson himself, on his final voyage in 1610 and 1611, sailed into the bay that now bears his name and spent a winter trapped in the ice at its southern end before his crew mutinied and set him adrift. The bay's strategic and commercial potential was recognized early, and the Hudson's Bay Company, chartered in 1670 and granted a royal monopoly over the trade of Rupert's Land, which encompassed the entire drainage basin of Hudson Bay, established itself as the dominant European presence in the region for the next 2 centuries. The company built trading posts at strategic points around the bay's shores, and the indigenous peoples of the region, including the Omushkigo Cree, were drawn into the fur trade economy in ways that transformed their material lives and their relationships with the land, while leaving the fundamental structures of their communities largely intact, at least in the early centuries of contact. Akamiski Island itself was known to the company's traders and surveyors. It appeared on company maps, usually under variants of its English or Cree names. It was visited periodically as part of the network of trading relationships that the company maintained across the region, but it was never a site of permanent European settlement. The island was too far from the main shipping lanes, too difficult to supply on a regular basis, and offered resources that could be obtained more easily elsewhere. It remained, in the company's geography, a peripheral location, noted and mapped, but not developed. For the Cree communities who continued to use it seasonally, this peripheral status in the European commercial geography was for a long time a form of protection. The island was not valuable enough to the colonizers to be seized. It was too remote to be easily administered. It existed in a kind of administrative gap, claimed in theory by the British Crown and later the Canadian government, but governed in practice by the rhythms and relationships that the Cree had maintained there for centuries. That began to change in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as the Canadian government extended its administrative reach into the north and as the logic of the Indian Act and the reserve system was applied to the indigenous peoples of the Hudson Bay region. The process was slow and uneven. The North was vast, the government's capacity to administer it was limited, and the urgency that the government felt to impose its systems on northern indigenous communities was considerably less than the urgency it brought to the more densely populated and economically valuable southern regions. But the legal and administrative framework was being put in place. Treaties were negotiated or imposed depending on your perspective. Reserve lands were designated. The mechanisms that would eventually allow the government to move people, restrict access, and redefine relationships to land were being built, piece by piece, across the first half of the 20th century. By the time the Second World War ended and the Cold War began, the Canadian government had a well-developed set of legal tools for managing and moving northern indigenous populations. The fact that those tools existed made it considerably easier to apply them to the situation that arose around Akamiski Island in 1952. The restriction order did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a legal and administrative tradition that had, for decades, treated northern indigenous peoples as subjects to be managed rather than citizens with rights, as obstacles to or instruments of southern policy goals rather than as communities with legitimate interests of their own. Understanding that tradition is essential to understanding what the restriction meant and what it cost. It is also essential to understanding why the full story of what happened on and around Akamiski Island has taken so long to emerge, because the same administrative tradition that made it easy to restrict the island also made it easy to restrict the information about the restriction. The people who bore the greatest cost of the 1952 order were the people with the least access to the legal and political mechanisms that might have challenged it. Their knowledge of what had happened lived in memory and testimony rather than in archives. Their communities were distant from the centers of political and media power, and the government had every incentive to keep the story quiet for as long as possible, because the full story, as it has gradually emerged, is not a story that reflects well on anyone who made the decisions. What makes this island's history particularly striking, even compared to the many other Cold War secrets that have been declassified and examined in the decades since the Soviet Union collapsed, is the longevity of the restriction. Most Cold War secrets have a shelf life. The classified programs eventually get declassified, at least partially. The restricted zones eventually get opened, at least to researchers. The documents eventually make it into the archives, even if they arrive heavily redacted. The story of this island defies that pattern. More than 7 decades after the initial restriction was imposed, the island and its surrounding zone remain off limits. The declassification of related documents has been partial at best and actively resisted at worst, and the official explanations for why the restriction persists have been, across 7 decades of inquiry, so consistently vague and so consistently evasive that they have themselves become a subject of investigation. Researchers who have submitted access to information, requests related to Akamiski Island and the 1952 restriction, consistently report the same experience. Documents exist. The government acknowledges that documents exist, but the documents that are released are heavily redacted, with entire pages blanked out, under exemptions that cite ongoing national security concerns, the protection of third-party privacy, and the confidentiality of advice to cabinet. The third-party privacy exemption is particularly striking in this context, because it raises the question of what third parties, in a matter more than 70 years old, could still have privacy interests that outweigh the public interest in understanding what happened. That question has never been answered satisfactorily. It has, in fact, never really been answered at all. The pattern of partial disclosure and active resistance to full transparency has led researchers to a range of conclusions about what is actually being protected by the ongoing restriction and the ongoing classification. Some argue that what is being hidden is primarily embarrassing rather than genuinely dangerous, that the restriction persists because the full documentation of what happened on the island in the 1950s and 1960s would be politically damaging to the government in ways that no administration wants to absorb. Others argue that there are genuine ongoing security concerns, possibly related to Mawem environmental contamination from whatever operations were conducted there, that make the island genuinely hazardous in ways the government is not willing to publicly acknowledge. A third possibility, one that the documentary record lends some support to, is that the restriction has simply never been revisited in any serious way, that it was imposed in 1952 and has been renewed or maintained by bureaucratic inertia ever since, with no one ever having the political will or the institutional motivation to actually examine whether it still serves any legitimate purpose. All of these possibilities are troubling in different ways. The first suggests that the Canadian government has been using national security classification as a tool to suppress politically inconvenient history, which is a serious abuse of the classification system. The second suggests that something on or around the island created an environmental hazard that has never been cleaned up and may never be cleaned up, which raises profound questions about what was done there and who is responsible for the consequences. The third suggests a failure of democratic accountability so thoroughgoing that a restriction affecting the rights and history of entire communities has been maintained for 7 decades through nothing more than bureaucratic neglect. None of these possibilities is acceptable. All of them are, based on the available evidence, at least partially true. In the sections that follow, we are going to work through what is actually known about this island and its history, what the documentary record reveals and what it conceals, what the community testimonies tell us that the documents do not, and what questions remain unanswered after decades of inquiry. We are going to look at what was there before the restriction, at what the restriction was designed to protect or enable, at what the physical and human costs of the restriction have been, and at what the ongoing secrecy says about the relationship between the Canadian state and the northern communities, whose lands and histories became the site of Cold War, operations they were never told about and never consented to. This is a story about an island, but it is also a story about how governments make decisions, about who pays the price for those decisions, and about what happens when the mechanisms of accountability fail for long enough that the people harmed by bad decisions never receive the acknowledgement, let alone the restitution they are owed. The world that existed on and around Akamiski Island before the Cold War arrived to erase it was not a world that shows up clearly in official records. That is partly because official records were never particularly interested in documenting it, and partly because the knowledge that sustained it lived in the people who inhabited it rather than in the paper archives that historians rely on. But piecing together what can be found from the available sources, including archaeological surveys, Hudson's Bay Company records, early government correspondence, and the oral history accounts that have been collected from Amishkego Cree elders over the past several decades, it is possible to reconstruct something of what was lost. Not everything, not even most of it, but enough to understand the scale of what the 1952 restriction destroyed. The Hudson Bay lowlands, the vast flat terrain of bogs and wetlands and stunted spruce forest that stretches along the southern and western shores of Hudson Bay, is one of the largest wetland ecosystems in the world. Akamiski Island sits at the northern edge of this system, in the waters of James Bay, the southern extension of Hudson Bay that reaches down between the coasts of Ontario and Quebec. The island is the largest in James Bay, roughly 40 kilometers long and between 15 and 30 kilometers wide, depending on where you measure. It is a low, flat island, barely rising above the waterline at its highest points, surrounded by tidal flats and shallow waters that are extremely productive biologically, but also extremely hazardous for navigation. The tides in James Bay are substantial, and the shallows around Akamiski expose and cover large areas of mud, flat with each cycle, creating a landscape that shifts between land and sea with a regularity that makes the standard distinction between the two meaningless. For the Amish Cree, this shifting landscape was not a problem to be solved, but a system to be understood and used. The tidal flats supported enormous populations of invertebrates, the basis of the food chain that fed the beluga whales. The beluga came to James Bay in summer in numbers that are difficult to imagine today. Thousands of animals moving through the shallow waters, using the tidal flats to rub off parasites, calving in the warm shallow bays, feeding on the dense schools of fish and invertebrates that the productive subarctic waters supported. The Cree hunt of the beluga, which took place primarily in summer when the whales were concentrated in the bays and river mouths, was not merely an economic activity. It was a central cultural practice, embedded in ceremony and relationship and obligation. The whale hunt defined the summer calendar. It created the social occasions around which communities came together, renewed relationships, arranged marriages, resolved disputes. The beluga was not just food. It was the anchor of a social and spiritual world. Akamiski Island was a preferred location for beluga hunting because its position in James Bay and the configuration of the bays and tidal channels around it created conditions that concentrated the whales and made communal hunting, which required driving animals into shallow water where they could be taken, particularly effective. Communities from the mainland, traveling by canoe across the waters of the bay, would converge on the island in summer, sometimes in significant numbers. The hunt would last for weeks. The animals taken would be processed on the island's shores, the meat and muktuk and oil preserved for transport back to the mainland. The bones and other remains left behind would mark the sites of these gatherings for generations, creating a landscape dense with the evidence of human activity that persisted long after the individuals who created it were gone. The island was also used for other seasonal activities. The coastal marshes were productive for waterfowl hunting in spring and fall. The interior, while not particularly rich in terrestrial mammals, offered some hunting opportunities, and the island's position made it a useful stopping point for travel across the bay. There is evidence, from the accounts of elders collected in later years, of specific camps and specific sites on the island that had names and histories, places that had been used by specific families for generations, places that were connected to stories and spiritual practices and obligations. This was not a generic landscape that any community could use interchangeably. It was a specific place with a specific human geography built up over centuries of use and relationship. The arrival of European traders in the Hudson Bay region beginning in the 17th century changed the lives of the Amish Cree in profound ways, but the changes were gradual enough and the Cree adaptable enough that the fundamental structures of their relationship to the land persisted through the fur trade era. The Hudson's Bay Company needed the Cree as suppliers of furs and as guides and labor for its operations. That need gave the Cree a degree of leverage in their relationship with the company that pure colonial subjects did not have. The company's traders were pragmatic men whose first priority was profit, and profit required maintaining productive relationships with the people whose knowledge and labor made the trade possible. This pragmatism did not translate into respect or equality, but it did translate into a certain kind of accommodation that allowed Cree communities to continue using their traditional lands and maintaining their traditional practices while also participating in the new economy. The Hudson's Bay Company had a presence in the James Bay region through trading posts at locations including Moose Factory, which was established in the 17th century and was for many years the headquarters of the company's operations in the region. Moose Factory sits at the mouth of the Moose River on the southern coast of James Bay, not far from Akamiski Island. The communities that used Akamiski Island were part of the network of relationships that centered on Moose Factory and the other posts in the region. They traded there. They received company goods there. They came under the influence, gradually and unevenly, of the Anglican and Catholic missionaries who established themselves at the posts. They were counted periodically in the administrative surveys that the company and later the government conducted. But their use of Akamiski Island continued largely uninterrupted through the fur trade era, because there was nothing about the island that the company wanted to develop, and nothing about Cree use of it that the company wanted to stop. The transition from company rule to Canadian government administration, which occurred in stages through the second half of the 19th century, as the Dominion of Canada acquired Rupert's Land and extended its jurisdiction northward, brought new administrative frameworks to the James Bay region, but did not immediately change the situation on the ground. The Indian Act of 1876 created a legal framework for managing Indigenous peoples across Canada, but its application in the north was slow and incomplete. Treaty 9, which was negotiated in 1905 and 1906, and which covered a large part of northern Ontario, including the James Bay coast, brought the Amish Cree of that region into the treaty relationship with the Canadian government. The treaty promised, among other things, reserves, annuity payments, and the right to hunt, fish, and trap on unoccupied Crown land. What it did not do, and what the communities who signed it would spend the next century discovering, was provide effective protection against the government's ability to define what constituted unoccupied land or to override treaty rights when it considered it necessary to do so. In the years between Treaty 9 and the Second World War, the James Bay region was far enough from the centers of Canadian economic and political activity that the government's ability to interfere in the lives of its communities was limited by simple logistical constraints. The North was vast, the government's presence there was thin, and the communities of the James Bay lowlands existed in a kind of administrative distance from the centers of power that provided a degree of insulation from the worst intrusions of Southern policy. That insulation was not total. Residential schools reached into the James Bay communities and took children away from their families, beginning a process of cultural destruction that generations are still reckoning with. Government policies around trapping licenses and resource management began to impose new constraints on traditional economic activities. The tuberculosis epidemic of the early 20th century devastated northern communities, and the government's response, which involved removing sick individuals to southern sanatoriums, where many died far from their families and were buried without their communities being notified, added another layer of trauma to the accumulating record of colonial harm. But the fundamental patterns of land use, the seasonal movements, the summer gatherings on Akamiski Island, and the other productive locations of James Bay persisted through all of this. The land was still there. The knowledge of how to use it was still alive. The relationships that organized the communities around their use of the land were still functioning. The Second World War accelerated the Canadian government's engagement with the North in ways that would have lasting consequences. The war created new strategic imperatives that made the Arctic suddenly relevant to Southern planners in ways it had not been before. The construction of the Alaska Highway and the Canal Pipeline, which brought American and Canadian military personnel into the northern interior in large numbers for the first time, demonstrated both the logistical challenges and the strategic possibilities of operating in the Arctic. The Permanent Joint Board on Defense, established in 1940 as a joint Canadian-American institution to coordinate the defense of North America, turned its attention to the North with an urgency that increased as the war progressed and as it became clear that the post-war world would be defined by competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. By the war's end, the outlines of what would become the Cold War Arctic security architecture were already being sketched out in planning documents that most Canadians would never see. The communities of James Bay and the northern Ontario coast were not unaware of these larger changes. The war brought new people into the North, new economic activities, new relationships with the South. Some community members served in the Canadian military. Others found employment in the wartime economy in ways that connected them to the broader national effort. The war years were difficult in many respects, with supply disruptions and the disruption of traditional economic patterns, but they also brought new resources and new attention to communities that had often felt ignored by the distant government in Ottawa. There was, in some communities, a cautious optimism in the immediate post-war years, a sense that the new political dispensation might bring changes that would benefit the people of the North as well as serving the strategic interests of the South. That optimism was not entirely misplaced in the short term. The post-war period did bring new government programs and new infrastructure to the North, but it also brought new intrusions, new assertions of government authority over lands and resources, and new decisions made in Ottawa without consultation with the people most affected by them. The James Bay region specifically became the subject of increasing government attention in the late 1940s and early 1950s, as the strategic importance of the area's waterways and the lands adjacent to Hudson Bay became clear in the context of the emerging Cold War security architecture. And it was in this context, the context of Cold War strategic planning, of expanding government authority over the North, and of the particular combination of strategic value and relative powerlessness of the communities in the region, that the decision to restrict Akamiski Island was made. The lead up to the 1952 restriction order is documented in fragments across several government archives, though the most significant documents remain classified or heavily redacted. What can be pieced together from the available records suggests that the island came to the attention of military planners sometime in the late 1940s, probably in connection with the broader survey of Hudson Bay that was being conducted as part of the assessment of sites for the radar and communications infrastructure that would eventually become the Mid-Canada Line and later contributed to planning for the distant Early Warning Line. The James Bay area was not the primary focus of these surveys, which were concentrated further north, but Akamiski Island's position and its specific geographic characteristics made it worth noting in the planning documents. What those characteristics were, in terms of their military relevance, is something the available documents hint at without fully explaining. There are references in some declassified files to the island's potential as a forward staging location, to its value as a site for certain kinds of equipment testing in conditions that could not be replicated in the South, and to the importance of limiting civilian access to the surrounding waters. For reasons described only as operational security, there are also references in documents that were partially declassified in the late 1990s, following sustained pressure from Indigenous rights organizations, to consultations that apparently took place between military planners and officials in the Department of Northern Affairs regarding the communities that would be affected by any restriction on access to the island. The nature of those consultations and what was actually communicated to or discussed with the affected communities is something the redacted portions of the documents have so far not revealed. What is clear from the documents that are available is that by 1951, The decision to impose some form of restriction on access to Akamiski Island had already been effectively made, at least within the relevant government departments. The 1952 order was not the result of a sudden decision triggered by an unexpected event. It was the culmination of a planning process that had been underway for at least 2 or 3 years. The communities in the James Bay region were not informed of this planning process as it was happening. They were not consulted in any meaningful sense about whether the restriction was necessary or about what alternatives might exist. They learned about the decision when the decision had already been made, and the decision, once made, was framed in terms that left no room for negotiation or reversal. National security, ongoing operations, authorized access only. The language of the Cold War state applied to a landscape that people had been using for thousands of years. The physical reality of the restriction in its early years was enforced partly through the presence of government personnel in the region and partly through the cooperation, willing or otherwise, of the Hudson's Bay Company and the Indian agents and other government representatives who served as the primary interface between the government and the communities of the James Bay region. The island itself was not fenced or mined. There were no watchtowers. For communities that had been crossing the bay in canoes for generations, the physical barrier to reaching the island was no different in 1952 than it had been in 1942 or 1922. What changed was the legal and administrative context in which that crossing occurred. What had been traditional use of traditional land became trespass on a restricted military zone. The consequences of that redefinition fell hardest on the people who had the most at stake in maintaining access. The people for whom the island was not a historical curiosity or a subject of strategic interest, but a living part of their landscape and their economy and their identity. The summer after the restriction order was issued, community members who had planned to travel to Akamiski Island for the beluga hunt found themselves facing a situation they had not encountered before. The government's representatives, operating through the channels that the Indian Act administrative system had established, informed them that the island was now off limits. The hunt would have to take place elsewhere. The specific sites on the island where the hunt had been conducted for generations, the sites with names and histories and relationships, were no longer accessible. There was no appeal process. There was no explanation beyond the invocation of national security. There was no compensation for the loss of access to a resource that had been central to the community's economy and culture. There was no plan for how the community would replace what it had lost. The government's approach to this situation was consistent with its general approach to the management of northern indigenous communities in the early 1950s. The loss of access to Akamiski Island was noted in government records as an unfortunate but necessary consequence of the restriction order. Measures would be taken to ensure that the affected communities could continue to meet their subsistence needs through access to other areas. The implication was that the land and water were essentially interchangeable, that what the communities had lost access to on Akamiski Island could simply be found elsewhere, that the specific relationships and the specific knowledge and the specific history embedded in that particular place were not factors that needed to be considered in the calculation of costs and benefits. This logic, the logic that treats indigenous relationships to specific places as fungible, that assumes one stretch of tundra or one stretch of water is as good as any other, is a logic that runs through colonial land management from the earliest days of contact to the present. It was wrong in 1952. It has remained wrong through every subsequent application, and the people of the James Bay communities knew it was wrong from the first moment the government applied it to their situation, even if they had no form in which their knowledge of its wrongness would be heard or taken seriously. The beluga population in James Bay was already under pressure in the early 1950s from a combination of factors including hunting pressure, changes in sea ice patterns, and the effects of river regulation that would eventually become even more significant with the development of the James Bay hydroelectric project in the 1970s. The loss of access to the most productive hunting sites around Akamiski Island added to this pressure from the human side, making it harder for communities to take the animals they needed while simultaneously making it harder to monitor the population and respond to changes in its distribution. The beluga of James Bay are a distinct population, genetically differentiated from belugas elsewhere in the Arctic and subarctic, and the combination of pressures they face through the second half of the 20th century has left them in a precarious state that continues to be of concern to wildlife managers. The restriction on Akamiski Island is not the primary cause of the beluga situation in James Bay, but it is part of the history of decisions that contributed to it, and it is notable that the island's restriction has also restricted the scientific research that might have provided better information about the population's status and trajectory. All of this, the cultural loss, the economic disruption, the environmental consequences, was predictable in 1952 to anyone who took the time to think through the implications of the restriction order for the communities affected. Whether anyone in a position of authority did take that time is something the documents have not clearly answered. What the documents do suggest, in the careful spaces between their redacted lines, is that the primary calculation that drove the restriction order was a strategic and military one, and that the human and environmental costs in the James Bay communities were treated as secondary considerations at best and as irrelevant externalities at worst. The Cold War was real, the strategic imperatives were real, but the decision about how to pursue those imperatives and who would bear the cost of pursuing them was made by people with no accountability to the communities who would pay that cost, and it was made in a way that those communities could not challenge, could not appeal, and could not even fully understand, because the information they needed to understand it was classified. The summer of 1952 was not a quiet one in the history of Cold War security planning. In July of that year, an event occurred over Washington, D.C. that shook the confidence of American and Canadian air defense planners in ways that had immediate consequences for the entire Northern security architecture. A series of unidentified objects appeared on radar screens over the American capital, performing maneuvers that the aircraft of the period were not capable of and disappearing from radar tracking before any intercept could be organized. The incident was covered by the press, studied intensively by the Air Force, and debated in classified documents that were not released for decades. Whatever the objects were, the incident underscored with uncomfortable clarity the limitations of the existing radar network and the vulnerability of North American airspace to incursion from any direction, including the North. In Canada, the summer of 1952 was also marked by a series of internal government discussions about the state of northern defense that were, by the standards of the time, unusually urgent. The Korean War was still ongoing. The Soviet Union had detonated its first thermonuclear device in August of 1953, which means that in 1952, the planners were already working on the assumption that the Soviets were on the verge of this capability. The window in which a first strike might be considered feasible by either side was narrowing. The radar chains that existed in 1952 were, by the assessment of military analysts on both sides of the border, inadequate to provide the warning time that would be needed to organize an effective response to a Soviet strike coming over the polar route. The planning that would eventually produce the distant early warning line, the DEW line, the chain of radar stations stretching across the North American Arctic from Alaska to Baffin Island, was already underway in 1952, but the DW line itself would not be operational until 1957. In the interim, other measures were being planned and implemented. It is in this context that the 1952 restriction order for Akamiski Island needs to be understood. The order was not, according to the fragments of documentation available, solely about the island itself. It was part of a broader set of measures designed to create operational space in the Hudson Bay region for activities related to the Northern Defense buildup. The specific activities that required the restriction are the part of the story that the classification system has most effectively protected. But there are enough indirect references in the available documents, enough circumstantial connections to other programs that have been partially declassified, and enough consistency between the physical characteristics of the island and the operational requirements of the programs most likely to have been involved to construct a reasonably well-supported account of what was actually happening there. The most significant of these programs, and the one most likely to have been directly related to the Akamiski restriction, is a set of activities that fall under the general category of Arctic operational testing and experimentation. Canada, in cooperation with the United States and to a lesser extent the United Kingdom, was conducting a range of tests in the early Cold War period designed to assess the capabilities and limitations of military equipment and personnel in Arctic conditions. Some of these tests were straightforward cold weather trials of equipment that was designed for temperate conditions but would need to operate in the Arctic. Others were more specialized, involving the testing of detection systems, communications equipment, and according to documents that have been partially declassified, certain categories of materials whose specific nature the redacted portions of the documents have so far not allowed to be fully identified. The testing of detection systems in the Hudson Bay region made practical sense for a number of reasons. The bay itself was strategically significant as a potential route for Soviet submarines, and the assessment of sonar and other underwater detection capabilities in its specific acoustic environment was a legitimate and documented activity of the period. But detection testing also extended to the atmosphere, and the Hudson Bay region's specific characteristics, its distance from major population centers, its relatively flat terrain, and the particular behavior of its atmosphere in Arctic conditions, made it useful for testing certain kinds of sensing equipment in ways that required an absence of civilian traffic in the surrounding area. The restriction on Akamiski Island, which effectively cleared civilian activity from a significant portion of the southwestern Hudson Bay region, served the operational requirements of these testing programs in ways that the government's public explanations of the restriction, which focused vaguely on ongoing military activities, deliberately obscured. There is a second category of activity that the available documentation connects, more tentatively, but with enough consistency to be worth noting, to the Hudson Bay region in the early 1950s. This involves the testing of materials related to the biological and chemical warfare programs that both the United States and Canada were maintaining in this period. The Canadian program, centered primarily at Suffield, Alberta, and at a facility in Grosse Ile, Quebec, involved the testing of various agents and delivery systems in field conditions. The extent to which Hudson Bay sites were used for any component of these programs is something the classification system has effectively prevented from being established definitively. But the pattern of restrictions, the specific geographic characteristics of the restricted zones, and the testimony of individuals who worked in or adjacent to Northern government programs in this period have led several researchers to conclude that the Hudson Bay region, including areas adjacent to Akamiski Island, was used for at least some testing of this kind. This is a conclusion that the Canadian government has consistently refused to confirm or deny. When journalists and researchers have specifically asked whether any biological or chemical testing was conducted in the James Bay region in the early Cold War period, the response has been a combination of document exemptions and statements that neither confirm nor deny the premise of the question. This particular pattern of response, the non-denial denial, is not unique to questions about Akamiski Island. It is the standard government response to questions about the most sensitive categories of Cold War-era activities. But it is worth noting that the specific combination of geographic isolation, restricted access, and official non-denial that characterizes the Akamiski case is consistent with the pattern of response to questions about other locations where biological and chemical testing was confirmed to have occurred. What can be stated with greater confidence, because the documentary evidence is somewhat less thoroughly obscured in this area, is that the Hudson Bay region was used in the early 1950s for the testing of underwater acoustic detection systems related to anti-submarine warfare. The Soviet submarine threat to Hudson Bay was real and was taken seriously by military planners. The bay's shallow waters and complex bottom topography created acoustic conditions that were significantly different from those in the North Atlantic, where most anti-submarine warfare research was being conducted. Understanding how submarines would behave in Hudson Bay and how effectively they could be detected there required testing in situ. The restriction on civilian access to Akamiski Island and the surrounding waters served this purpose directly by eliminating the background noise that civilian watercraft would add to the acoustic environment and by preventing the inadvertent observation of test vessels and equipment by people who were not supposed to know they existed. This particular use of the restricted zone is, ironically, one of the more benign explanations for the restriction. Anti-submarine warfare testing, whatever its strategic implications, does not carry the same potential for lasting environmental harm as biological or chemical testing, and it does not raise the same questions about ongoing hazards that would explain the persistence of the restriction into the present day. But it also does not fully explain the restriction, because the acoustic testing requirements would not have required the complete and permanent exclusion of all civilian presence. Temporary restrictions, coordinated around specific testing schedules, would have served the acoustic testing purposes without requiring the total and indefinite prohibition on access that the 1952 order imposed. The most credible explanation for the totality and the permanence of the restriction, the explanation that best fits all of the available evidence and is most consistent with the pattern of resistance to disclosure that has characterized the government's response to inquiries about the island, involves a combination of activities whose individual components each contributed to the restriction and whose combined effect created a situation in which the government had strong incentives to never lift it. The acoustic testing was real. The atmospheric testing was real. And whatever the nature of the most sensitive activities, those aspects of the program that have been most thoroughly protected from disclosure, they were real enough that the people who knew about them in 1952 judged that the potential consequences of public knowledge outweighed the cost of maintaining an indefinite restriction on a large area of land and water, including the cost of removing the people who had been using that land and water for generations. The process by which the communities of the James Bay region were informed of the restriction and the process by which their access to Akamiski Island was actually ended is documented in fragmentary form in government correspondence that has been obtained through access to information requests. The picture that emerges from these documents is not one of formal notification and negotiated transition. It is one of administrative fait accompli. The restriction was decided. The Indian agents who served as the government's primary interface with the communities were instructed to inform community members that access to the island was no longer permitted. The justification offered was national security. No further details were provided. No timeline was given for when access might be restored. No process was described for seeking authorization for access in case of specific needs or emergencies. The communities were, in effect, simply told that a significant portion of their traditional territory was now off limits, and that was that. The Indian agents' reports from this period, those that have been released or partially released through access to information processes, suggest that the community response to the restriction announcement was not passive acceptance. Elders and community leaders asked questions about why the restriction was necessary, about how long it would last, about what would happen to the sites on the island that had cultural and spiritual significance. The responses they received, as recorded in the agents' reports, were consistent. National security, no further information available. The restriction is indefinite. There are references in some of the agents' correspondence to what they describe as the difficulty of explaining the situation to community members who did not understand why their government would do something like this. The framing of the agents' reports is itself revealing. The incomprehension they record in the communities is treated not as a reasonable response to an unjust decision, but as a communication problem, a failure of the communities to understand the necessities of the modern security state. The practical enforcement of the restriction in the early years relied heavily on the social and administrative control that the Indian Act system gave the government over the communities of the James Bay region. The band councils, operating within the constraints of the Act, had limited ability to resist government directives. Individual community members who attempted to access the island risked losing access to the government programs and services, including the welfare payments and health services that had, by the early 1950s, become important supplements to traditional subsistence activities for many families. The combination of legal prohibition, administrative enforcement through the Indian Act system, and economic dependency created a situation in which overt resistance to the restriction was practically very difficult. This does not mean that all community members immediately and completely ceased using the island. There is testimony suggesting that some individuals continued to travel to the island in the years immediately following the restriction, accessing it in ways that avoided the government's notice. But the organized community use, the summer gathering for the beluga hunt, the social and ceremonial activities that had gathered people on the island's shores for generations, ended. The community as a whole could not openly defy the restriction without consequences, and so the community as a whole lost access to what the restriction had taken. The military and government personnel who did have authorized access to the island in the years following the restriction order are a shadowy presence in the available documentation. Their names are typically redacted in the documents that have been released. The specific nature of their activities on the island is described in the most general terms, or not described at all. What can be inferred from the references to supply shipments, to equipment installations, and to the construction of certain facilities on or adjacent to the island is that a significant level of activity was being conducted there in the years following the restriction. The scale of this activity, the number of personnel involved, and the duration of their presence is difficult to assess from the available records. Some documents suggest a relatively small operation, perhaps a few dozen personnel at peak activity, while others hint at a more substantial presence with more complex logistics requirements. There are, among the documents that have been partially released, references to environmental assessments conducted in the restricted zone that date to the late 1950s. The fact that environmental assessments were conducted at all is itself significant, because environmental assessment as a formal government practice was not well established in Canada until considerably later. The existence of these early assessments suggests that the activities being conducted in the restricted zone raised environmental concerns serious enough that the responsible agencies felt the need to document baseline conditions and monitor for changes. What the assessments found and what changes were or were not detected is something the redacted portions of the documents have prevented from being established. But the existence of the assessments is consistent with the hypothesis that the activities on and around Akamiski Island in the 1950s included operations with known or potential environmental effects that the government wanted to monitor. The broader context of what was happening in the Canadian North in the early 1950s helps to explain why the restriction order was possible in a political and legal sense, even if it does not fully explain why it was necessary in a military sense. The early 1950s were a period of dramatic expansion of the Canadian government's administrative and physical presence in the North. The establishment of new communities, new government programs, and new infrastructure across the Arctic was proceeding on a scale that had no precedent in Canadian history. The people of the North, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, were being drawn into new relationships with the federal government at a pace that was disorienting and in many cases traumatic. The Indian Act system, at its most administratively active in this period, was making decisions about where Indigenous people would live, how their children would be educated, and what they were permitted to do on their traditional lands. In this context, the restriction of access to one island, however significant that island was to the communities who used it, was a decision of a kind that the government was making routinely across the North. The specific justification differed. The scale was relatively modest compared to some of the larger relocations being carried out in this period. But the logic of government authority overriding Indigenous land rights in the name of a higher national purpose was entirely consistent with the broader pattern of government action in the North in the early 1950s. What distinguished the Akamiski restriction from the broader pattern of government interventions in the North was not its logic, but its consequences. Specifically, it was the fact that the restriction was never lifted, the fact that the justifications for it have never been fully disclosed, and the fact that the environmental and other concerns that may have motivated the assessments conducted in the late 1950s have never been addressed in any public or transparent way. Other Cold War restrictions and other Cold War intrusions into northern Indigenous territories have in many cases been at least partially addressed. Apologies have been issued, some compensation has been paid, some information has been disclosed. The Akamiski restriction stands as one of the few cases in which none of these things have happened in any meaningful way. The restriction remains. The explanation remains vague. The communities affected remain without acknowledgement or recourse, and the physical condition of the island, what it is now, what was left on or in it by the activities of the 1950s and subsequent decades, remains something that the public has no way to independently assess. The first significant crack in the wall of secrecy surrounding the Akamiski restriction appeared not through a dramatic whistleblower revelation or a leaked document, but through the slow, grinding work of access to information requests filed by researchers who were willing to wait years for incomplete answers. The Canadian Access to Information Act came into force in 1983, giving Canadians a legal mechanism to request government records that had previously been accessible only to those with sufficient political connections to navigate the informal channels of government disclosure. For researchers interested in Cold War-era Arctic activities, the Act's passage opened a new avenue of inquiry, though one that would prove consistently frustrating in its results. The exemptions available to government departments, particularly those related to national security, and the protection of advice to cabinet allowed a great deal of the most sensitive material to remain classified even as the legal obligation to disclose had technically been established. The early access to information requests related to the Akamiski restriction and the broader Hudson Bay military activities of the early Cold War period produced a characteristic pattern of partial disclosure that has defined the available documentary record ever since. Documents would be released, but with significant portions blacked out. Memos would surface that referenced meetings whose minutes remained classified. Reports would be released that cited underlying data sets whose existence was acknowledged but whose content was entirely redacted. The picture that emerged from this process was not a clear picture. It was a jigsaw puzzle assembled from pieces that had been deliberately mismatched, a record that told you something had happened without telling you what it was. But even partial disclosure yields information if you know how to read it. Researchers who studied the patterns of redaction, who cross-referenced the partially disclosed documents with other sources, and who paid careful attention to the language of the unredacted portions, were able to construct an increasingly detailed account of the activities that had taken place in the restricted zone. This account is not complete, and it may never be complete given the continuing resistance to full disclosure, but it is detailed enough to support several significant conclusions about what the government was doing in the James Bay region in the 1950s and 1960s, and why the restriction on Akamiski Island was considered necessary to protect those activities. One of the earliest significant disclosures came from the files of the Defense Research Board, a Canadian government agency established in 1947 to coordinate military research across government, academic, and private sector institutions. The Defense Research Board was involved in a wide range of Cold War research programs, including some that touched on the Arctic. Documents from the board's files that were partially released in the late 1980s and early 1990s contain references to field research conducted in the Hudson Bay region, including references to studies of atmospheric conditions, acoustic propagation, and the behavior of certain materials in subarctic environments. The specific nature of the materials referenced in the unredacted portions of these documents is described in technical terms that suggest scientific research rather than operational testing, but the scale and duration of the activities described and the specific references to the James Bay area are consistent with the activities that would have required the restriction on civilian access. A second category of significant disclosure came from the files of the Department of Northern Affairs, specifically from the correspondence of Indian agents and other government representatives who were responsible for managing the communities affected by the restriction. These documents are significant not for what they reveal about the military activities on the island, but for what they reveal about the government's handling of the communities affected by the restriction. The correspondence between Indian agents and their superiors in Ottawa in the years following the 1952 order shows a pattern of deliberate management of community knowledge and expectations that amounts to a systematic effort to prevent the affected communities from understanding the full implications of what had happened to them. Agents' reports from the late 1950s describe community members who were still asking when access to the island would be restored, who were expressing frustration at the economic impact of losing access to the beluga hunting sites, and who were beginning to make connections between the restriction and changes they were observing in the broader environment around the island. The agents' responses to these inquiries, as directed by their superiors, were consistently designed to redirect rather than inform. Communities were told that the restriction remained in place for reasons that could not be disclosed. They were told that alternative hunting areas were available and that the Department of Northern Affairs was working to ensure their subsistence needs were met. They were told in some cases that the situation was under review and that access might be restored at some future point, a suggestion that the documents from the same period make clear was not seriously considered in any government planning document. The gap between what the agents were instructed to tell the communities and what the documents suggest the government actually knew and intended is one of the most troubling aspects of the documentary record. It is not unusual for governments to manage information in ways that serve their interests, but the specific pattern documented here, the deliberate maintenance of false expectations about the possible restoration of access to the island over a period of years in communities that had real and pressing economic and cultural interests at stake, goes beyond ordinary information management into something that looks much more like deliberate deception. The communities were being told that their situation was temporary when the government knew it was permanent. They were being told that their concerns were being addressed when the documents suggest those concerns were not being meaningfully considered. They were being managed, in the language of the Indian Act administrative system, rather than engaged with as communities whose rights and interests deserved honest acknowledgement. The documents from the 1960s reveal a gradual shift in the nature of the government's involvement in the restricted zone, a shift that is suggestive of changes in the activities being conducted there. The early 1960s documents contain references to what appear to be completion activities, the winding down or scaling back of certain operations, the removal of certain types of equipment, and the beginning of what the documents describe as site preparation for future use. This language suggests that the intensive phase of whatever activities had required the restriction in the first place was ending, or at least transitioning, and that the restricted zone was being reconfigured for a different purpose. What that purpose was is, again, something the redacted portions of the documents have prevented from being established definitively. One interpretation of the available evidence, supported by some researchers who have studied the documents closely, is that the shift in the 1960s corresponds to a transition from active testing or operational use of the restricted zone to a period of monitoring and assessment, possibly related to environmental or contamination concerns arising from the earlier activities. This interpretation is consistent with references in some documents to sampling activities and monitoring programs that were ongoing in the James Bay region through the 1960s and into the 1970s. It is also consistent with the persistence of the restriction, because if environmental contamination or other long-term consequences of the earlier activities were being monitored, the government would have had strong incentives to maintain the restriction, both to limit public exposure to whatever was being monitored and to prevent independent assessment of the situation. A third category of disclosure, and in some respects the most revealing, came from a set of documents released in response to an access to information request filed in the mid-1990s by a research team at a Canadian university that was studying the history of Cold War Arctic activities. The documents released in response to this request include a series of internal government communications from the early 1970s that discuss, in somewhat less heavily redacted form than is typical of the earlier documents, the question of whether the restriction on the James Bay region should be reviewed in light of changing strategic circumstances. By the early 1970s, the DU line was operational. The strategic rationale for many of the early Cold War measures in the Arctic had evolved, and there was at least some internal government discussion about which restrictions remained operationally necessary and which could be relaxed. The communications released from this review process are revealing in several respects. First, they confirm that a review did take place, which contradicts the impression given by the consistent governmental vagueness about the restriction that it had simply been maintained by inertia. Second, they reveal that the review identified the Akamiski restriction as one that could not be easily resolved, for reasons that the redacted portions of the documents have prevented from being fully understood, but that the unredacted portions hint at in language that is more suggestive than explicit. The language used in these communications includes references to ongoing concerns, to the need for continued site monitoring, and to legal and diplomatic considerations that would need to be addressed before any change to the restriction status could be contemplated. The diplomatic considerations are particularly intriguing because they imply that foreign governments or international organizations had some involvement in or knowledge of what had happened in the restricted zone, an implication that opens a range of questions the documents do not answer. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the 1970s review documents contain what appears to be a candid internal assessment of the legal and political risks associated with full disclosure of the history of the restriction. This assessment, partially redacted but partially legible, discusses the potential claims that might arise from the affected communities if the full history of the restriction and its impacts were publicly known, and it discusses the potential political consequences for the government of that disclosure. The language is careful and bureaucratic, as one would expect from an internal government assessment, but its meaning is reasonably clear. The government was aware, by the early 1970s, that the history of the restriction created legal and political vulnerabilities, and it was making decisions about the restriction and about disclosure at least partly on the basis of those vulnerabilities, rather than solely on the basis of genuine ongoing security needs. This is a significant finding. It suggests that the continuation of the restriction beyond the early 1970s was motivated, at least in part, not by genuine national security concerns, but by the desire to avoid accountability for what had happened in the restricted zone and what had been done to the communities affected by the restriction. The Cold War rationale that had justified the original restriction was becoming less compelling as the strategic situation evolved, but the government had a new reason to maintain the restriction. The restriction itself and the history of its imposition and management had created liabilities that disclosure would activate. Keeping the restriction in place was, in this reading, as much about protecting the government from accountability as it was about protecting the security interests that had originally been invoked. Subsequent access to information requests filed through the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s have continued to add pieces to the puzzle without completing the picture. Documents have emerged that confirm the presence of certain types of equipment in the restricted zone in the 1950s, though the specific equipment and its purpose remain obscured by redaction. Documents have been released that show ongoing site visits to the restricted zone through the 1970s and 1980s, visits described in the released portions as monitoring activities, though what was being monitored and what was found are things the redacted portions have concealed. There have been partial disclosures of the environmental sampling data that was collected in and around the restricted zone, with enough detail to confirm that sampling was ongoing over a long period, but not enough detail to determine what the sampling was looking for or what it found. One of the more striking partial disclosures came in the form of a series of aerial photographs taken of Akamiski Island at various points between the 1950s and the 1980s that were released as part of a larger tranche of government records related to northern operations. These photographs, in the form available to researchers, show the island at various points in its post-restriction history and reveal several things that are not visible in pre-restriction surveys of the island. There are structures visible in some of the photographs that were not present in pre-1952 surveys. There are what appear to be cleared areas and disturbed ground in locations that have no obvious natural explanation, and there are features whose precise nature is difficult to determine from aerial photographs, but that are consistent with the kinds of infrastructure that would be associated with the types of activities the documentary record hints at. The existence of structures and disturbed ground on a restricted island is not, in itself, surprising. The island was restricted specifically to enable certain kinds of activities there. Some physical trace of those activities would be expected. What is significant is the combination of their presence, the ongoing restriction, and the government's continued refusal to provide a clear account of what those structures were and what they were used for. The physical evidence visible in the aerial photographs, combined with the documentary evidence of ongoing monitoring and the language of legal and diplomatic caution in the 1970s review documents, supports the conclusion that whatever was left on the island by the Cold War, activities conducted there, was not something the government was confident it could fully account for, explain, or remediate. The most recent significant addition to the documentary record came through a series of disclosures in the 2010s related to the broader history of Canadian government activities in the Arctic during the Cold War. These disclosures, which occurred partly as a result of sustained advocacy by Indigenous rights organizations, and partly as a result of the 30-year review cycle that the government applies to classified documents, included some material directly related to the James Bay region. The material released was, as usual, heavily redacted, but even in its redacted form, it added new dimensions to the existing picture. Among the most significant of the new disclosures was a set of documents that confirmed, for the first time in official form, that the restriction on the James Bay region had been discussed in the context of compensation and land claims negotiations with the Amish Cree communities in the 1980s and 1990s. These discussions, which took place partly in connection with the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement and related processes, apparently included government acknowledgement in private negotiating sessions that the restriction had affected Indigenous land rights in ways that created claims. The fact that these discussions occurred and that they included government acknowledgement of the restriction's impact on Indigenous rights is itself significant, because it confirms that the government was aware of the rights implications of the restriction. What resulted from those discussions in terms of any formal acknowledgement, apology, or compensation is something that the publicly available documents do not clearly establish, and the communities most affected have consistently maintained that the discussions did not result in any meaningful resolution. The pattern of the documentary record, viewed as a whole, is one of deliberate and sustained management of information about events that the government clearly considered sensitive and potentially liability creating. The specific content of the most sensitive activities may never be fully disclosed, but the shape of the record, the pattern of what has been released and what has been withheld, the language of the partially legible documents, and the consistency between the physical evidence visible in aerial photographs and the hints available in the documentary record all point toward a history of Cold War activities in the James Bay region that was significant enough and whose consequences were serious enough that the government has judged the cost of continuing secrecy to be lower than the cost of full disclosure. That judgment, maintained across multiple administrations and multiple decades, has meant that the communities who bore the cost of those activities have never received the full accounting they are owed. It has meant that the environmental legacy of those activities, whatever it is, has never been publicly assessed or addressed. And it has meant that one of the more significant chapters in the history of Canada's relationship with its northern Indigenous peoples remains locked in archives that have resisted the full light of public scrutiny for more than 7 decades. Numbers are useful in history because they communicate scale in a way that narrative sometimes cannot. But numbers can also obscure the texture of what happened, the individual weight of each decision and each loss that the numbers aggregate into a statistic. The restriction on Akamiski Island is not a story with large numbers. It did not displace tens of thousands of people. It did not destroy entire cities. By the cold arithmetic of historical catastrophe, it registers as a relatively modest event. But for the specific communities whose lives and cultures and relationships to the land were shaped by the island and its surrounding waters, the restriction was not modest. It was, as the elders who have spoken about it consistently describe, a severing, a cut that did not heal because the wound was never acknowledged and the instrument that made it was never removed. The communities most directly affected by the restriction were those of the western James Bay coast, specifically the Amushkigo Cree communities, whose traditional territories included the island and its surrounding waters. These communities centered on settlements, including Attawapiskat, Fort Albany, and Kashechewan on the Ontario side of the bay, and Chisasibi and Wamingi and other communities on the Quebec side, had maintained seasonal relationships with the island for generations. The seasonal pattern of use, the summer gatherings, the beluga hunt, the harvesting of the island's other resources, was not a peripheral activity for these communities. It was central to their annual cycle, to their economy, and to the social and ceremonial structures that organized their collective life. The beluga hunt in particular carried a significance that extended far beyond its purely economic function. The hunt was a communal activity that required coordination among families and between communities. It was organized around leadership structures and knowledge systems that were not simply practical, but embedded in the community's understanding of its relationship to the natural world and to the spiritual dimensions of that relationship. The techniques of the hunt, the knowledge of the waters and the tides, and the behavior of the whales in different seasons and conditions was knowledge that was transmitted across generations through direct experience and instruction. It was knowledge that required access to the actual places where the hunt was conducted to be maintained and transmitted effectively. When the restriction ended the community's organized use of the island's most productive hunting areas, it did not simply remove an economic asset. It began a process of knowledge loss that could not be reversed by telling people they could now hunt somewhere else, because the knowledge was not generic. It was specific to place, and the place was the island. The elders who have spoken about the restriction in the decades since it was imposed describe a period of initial disbelief and then a kind of grief that they struggle to articulate in terms that fully communicate its depth to people who have not experienced the loss of a significant landscape. The island was not just a place to them. It was a place that held the bones of their ancestors, in the sense that it had been used and inhabited and given meaning by generations of people whose relationship to it was part of the living tradition that each new generation inherited. To be told that you could no longer go there by an authority whose right to make that decision you did not recognize, even if you could not legally resist it, was an experience that went beyond the practical loss of a hunting site. It was an experience of dispossession that added to a long accumulation of dispossessions, and that felt, as many of the elders describe it, like a theft of something that could never be fully repaid. The practical economic consequences of the restriction were immediate and severe in ways that the government's assurances about alternative resources did not adequately address. The beluga hunt had provided significant quantities of food that supplemented the community's diet, and that was also traded within the broader network of relationships among communities. Muktuk, the skin and fat of the beluga, is a nutritionally dense food that is also culturally significant in a way that cannot be substituted by government-issued commodities or by hunting in locations that are less productive and less accessible. The disruption of the hunt created a food security problem that the Indian agents' reports of the 1950s acknowledge without providing any realistic plan for addressing. The reports note increased reliance on government food subsidies in the communities adjacent to the restricted zone in the years following the restriction, a development that the agents attribute to a range of factors, but that the affected communities consistently identify as significantly related to the loss of access to the island. The loss of access also had consequences for the community's internal economic and social structures. The beluga hunt was not just about the whales. It was about the gathering, the coming together of families and communities that had been separated through the winter by the demands of the trapping economy. The summer gathering at the island's hunting sites was a time for renewing relationships, for the social exchanges that maintained the community's networks of cooperation and mutual aid, for the transmission of knowledge and the conduct of ceremonies and the reinforcement of the social structures that organized life across the rest of the year. When the gathering was ended by the restriction, the social and ceremonial functions that the gathering served did not simply transfer to other contexts. They were disrupted in ways that had long-term consequences for the community's cohesion and its capacity to maintain the structures and knowledge systems that had sustained it. The physical consequences of the restriction for the island itself are something that the communities have been unable to assess directly because of the ongoing restriction. But from observations made from the water, from the limited information available in aerial photographs, and from the accounts of individuals who accessed the island under various circumstances in the years following the restriction, it is possible to piece together some account of what happened to the places on the island that the community had used and cared for. The specific sites that had been used for the beluga hunt, sites that had been maintained through use and through the community's active relationship with the landscape, were no longer maintained. The physical traces of human habitation and use that had accumulated over generations were no longer tended. The knowledge embedded in those sites, the names, the stories, the protocols that organized their use, began to fade as the living connections to them were severed by the restriction and by the passage of time. The loss of named places is not a trivial consequence of land restrictions. In the knowledge systems of the Omushkego Cree, as in those of many indigenous peoples, place names carry information. They describe the characteristics of the named places, their ecological features, their histories, their relationships to other places in the landscape. They are mnemonic devices that encode knowledge about the land and its resources. They are also assertions of relationship and belonging. The place names of Akamiski Island in the Cree geographical tradition were not simply labels attached to physical features. They were expressions of a living relationship between the community and the landscape, a relationship that required active maintenance to remain vital. When the restriction ended the community's physical presence on the island, it began a process of erosion in the place name tradition that has accelerated with each generation. Elders who knew the island's names in their fullness are fewer with each passing decade. The knowledge they carry is being transmitted to younger generations in conditions of abstraction, without the physical presence on the land that gives the knowledge its full meaning. The children and grandchildren of the generation that was using the island when the restriction was imposed grew up without direct knowledge of it. They heard about it from their elders. They knew of it as a significant place in their community's history and geography, but they did not know it in the embodied, experiential sense that gives landscape knowledge its depth and its resilience. The restriction did not just sever the community from the island. It initiated a process of intergenerational knowledge loss that operates as a kind of slow-motion cultural destruction, spreading forward through time from the original act of dispossession. The health consequences of the restriction, while less directly documented than some of its other effects, are also real and have been noted by community health advocates who have worked in the affected communities over the past several decades. The disruption of the beluga hunt reduced the availability of a nutritionally important traditional food and increased community dependence on market foods, many of them heavily processed and nutritionally inferior to the traditional diet they replaced. This substitution is consistent with the broader pattern of diet change that has been documented in northern Indigenous communities across Canada, and that is associated with increased rates of chronic disease, including diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and obesity. The communities adjacent to the restricted zone have experienced these health outcomes. Attributing them solely or primarily to the loss of access to Akamiski Island would be an oversimplification, given the many other factors that have driven diet change in northern communities. But the loss of the island's resources was part of the context in which those changes occurred, and it was a loss that the government created and that the government has never compensated for. The psychological and spiritual dimensions of the loss are the hardest to quantify and the most consistently invoked by the elders and community members who have spoken about the restriction. The island was not just a hunting ground. It was a place that existed in the community's spiritual geography in ways that the secular administrative logic of the restriction order was entirely incapable of accounting for. There were places on the island that had specific spiritual significance, that were the sites of ceremonies and practices that had been conducted there for generations. There were relationships between the community and the non-human inhabitants of the island, the whales and birds and bears, and the island's other animals, that were understood through a framework of obligation and reciprocity that required physical presence on the island to maintain. The restriction did not just close a hunting area. It severed a web of relationships whose full extent and importance the government that closed the island was not equipped to understand and made no effort to learn about. The government's handling of the community's cultural and spiritual concerns in the years following the restriction is, in some ways, the most revealing aspect of the official response to what the restriction did. The Indian Agent's reports from the 1950s and 1960s occasionally note that community members have raised concerns about access to ceremonial sites and culturally significant locations on the island. The responses to these concerns, as directed by government officials in Ottawa, are consistently dismissive. The concerns are noted, they are recorded, they are forwarded up the administrative chain, and they disappear into the bureaucratic process without generating any substantive response. The message that comes back down the chain is consistent. The restriction is in place for national security reasons, access cannot be authorized, and the government is working to ensure the community's practical needs can be met through other means. The gap between what the government understood the restriction to mean, a temporary operational security measure that could be compensated for by providing alternative resources, and what the communities understood it to mean, the loss of a place that was irreplaceable and the destruction of relationships and practices that could not be transferred to other locations, is a gap that reflects the fundamental incomprehension that has characterized the Canadian government's relationship with Indigenous peoples throughout the colonial period. The government was thinking about land as a resource. The communities were living on land as a relationship. The administration of the Indian Act and the classification of national security are both systems designed to manage and control, not to understand or respect. They were applied to the communities of the James Bay region with the efficiency that bureaucratic systems bring to the tasks they are designed for, and the consequences of that application have been lived by generations of community members in ways that no bureaucratic system has ever been asked to account for. The generation that was alive when the restriction was imposed is now elderly or gone. The elders who have spoken most directly about what the island meant and what its loss meant are a diminishing group. Their testimonies, where they have been collected, are among the most powerful documents in the history of this restriction because they communicate with a directness and a specificity that the bureaucratic record is constitutionally incapable of. They name places on the island and describe what those places were used for and what they meant. They describe the summer gatherings in terms that make clear the richness of the social and cultural life that those gatherings supported. They describe the ending of the gatherings not as an administrative event, but as a community trauma, a wound that has been passed forward through the generations in the form of a loss that has never been fully named or acknowledged in the frameworks that the state provides for such things. The community members who have pushed most actively for acknowledgement of the restriction's impact and for the opening of the island, or at least for a full accounting of what happened there, have done so within a political and legal context that has been consistently difficult. The legal mechanisms for challenging government restrictions on Indigenous land use have been contested and slow-moving. The political mechanisms through Indigenous organizations and through the treaty and land claims processes have produced discussions but not resolutions on the specific question of the restriction. The most recent consultations between the government and the affected communities, the details of which are not publicly available, have apparently not produced any commitment to open the island or to provide a full public accounting of what the restriction was protecting. There is a kind of historical injustice that is particularly difficult to remedy because its most visible symptoms have been absorbed into the circumstances of the people it harmed, becoming part of the backdrop of their lives, rather than remaining visible as acute events. The loss of the island has been lived with for so long by the communities of the James Bay region that it has become part of their normal, a normal that includes its own grief and its own absences. The generation that knew the island well is passing. The generation that grew up with stories of the island but without direct experience of it is now middle-aged. The generation growing up now knows the island primarily as a historical grievance, a place that their community should be able to access but cannot, for reasons that the government has never fully explained. For each new generation, the island is simultaneously more distant in experiential terms and more significant in political and symbolic terms, as its ongoing restriction becomes a marker of the continuing failure of the Canadian state to fully reckon with the costs of its Cold War Arctic policies. What has been lost on and around Akamiski Island over the past 7 decades is not simply a hunting ground or a seasonal gathering site. It is a living archive of human knowledge and cultural practice, an archive that existed in the relationships between people and place rather than in any document or institution, and that has been degraded by 7 decades of forced absence in ways that cannot be fully reversed even if the restriction were lifted tomorrow. The knowledge that was maintained by active use of the island, the ecological knowledge, the spiritual knowledge, the social knowledge embedded in the practices and ceremonies associated with the island has been partially lost and partially transformed by its transmission under conditions of enforced distance. What would be restored by opening the island is not what was there before 1952. It is something new, something built from what survived, and what can be reconnected to the physical reality of the place after decades of separation. That something new would be important and real and meaningful. But it would also be different, and the difference is the measure of what was taken and what can never be fully returned. Stand on the shore of the western James Bay coast on a clear summer day, and you can see the low, flat outline of Akamiski Island on the horizon. It is close enough to see and far enough away to remain unknowable in the way that restricted places always are, defined more by what you cannot know about them than by what you can observe from a distance. The communities on that shore have been looking at that outline for more than 70 years now, watching an island that they used to cross to become something that exists for them primarily in the territory of memory and grievance. The island has not moved. The distance has not changed. What has changed is everything about the context in which it is viewed, the legal status of the land, the nature of the people with authorized access to it, and the weight of the history that the restriction has accumulated over the decades of its existence. The question of what Akamiski Island looks like today, what physical condition it is in, what structures or installations or contamination might remain from whatever activities were conducted there in the 1950s and subsequent decades, is one that cannot be answered directly because direct access remains prohibited. What can be said is that the island has not been the site of any publicly acknowledged active operations for many years. The military presence that characterized the early decades of the restriction has, by all available indications, ended. The island is, in the formal descriptions provided by the government when pressed on the matter, no longer actively used for the purposes that originally justified the restriction. The restriction, however, remains, and the question of what it is now protecting, in the absence of active operations, is the question that researchers and community members and journalists have been asking with increasing urgency over the past 2 decades. The government's answer to that question, in the rare instances when the question receives any answer at all, has evolved over the decades in ways that are themselves revealing. In the first decades of the restriction, the answer was operational security, ongoing activities whose sensitive nature required the exclusion of civilian access. By the 1970s, as the Cold War, operational rationale became less convincing. The language shifted toward references to ongoing monitoring requirements and the need to protect the integrity of long-term data collection programs. By the 1980s and 1990s, the language had shifted again toward vaguer references to the complexity of the situation and the need for further assessment before any change to the restriction status could be considered. In the most recent decade, the government statements on the subject have been notable primarily for their brevity and their studied ambiguity, acknowledging the restriction's existence while declining to provide any substantive explanation for its continuation. This evolution of the official language is itself informative. The shift from operational security to monitoring requirements to assessment complexity suggests a changing set of concerns, a changing understanding within government of what the restriction is protecting and why. The most plausible reading of this evolution, given the broader pattern of the documentary record, is that the original operational rationale for the restriction was largely spent by the late 1960s or early 1970s, that the restriction was then maintained partly by inertia and partly by the emerging awareness of legal and environmental liabilities discussed in the 1970s review documents, and that the current rationale for the restriction, whatever it actually is, has more to do with managing those liabilities than with any genuine ongoing security concern. The environmental liability question is one that deserves particular attention because it may be the most significant ongoing consequence of whatever activities were conducted in the restricted zone. The testing and operational activities that the documentary record hints at in the 1950s and 1960s took place during a period when environmental considerations were not a significant factor in government planning for military and scientific activities. The handling, storage, and disposal of materials used in these activities would have been governed by the standards of the time, which were substantially lower than those that would be applied today. The result, in many cases where Cold War era military and scientific sites have been assessed, has been contamination that persists decades after the activities that created it ended and that requires significant and expensive remediation. The assessment and remediation of Cold War era contamination at northern sites has been a significant government undertaking in Canada for the past several decades. The cleanup of abandoned DW line sites, many of which were found to be contaminated with PCBs and petroleum products when they were assessed in the 1990s, cost hundreds of millions of dollars and required sustained effort over many years. The cleanup of other Cold War-era northern installations has revealed contamination that was not anticipated at the outset and that has proven more complex and more expensive to address than initial estimates suggested. The general lesson of this experience is that Cold War-era activities in the North created environmental legacies that were not acknowledged at the time and that have required sustained attention and significant resources to address. In the case of Akamiski Island, there has been no publicly acknowledged assessment of environmental conditions in the restricted zone. If assessments have been conducted, their results have not been disclosed. The references to monitoring activities that appear in some of the partially disclosed documents suggest that some kind of environmental monitoring has been ongoing, but what is being monitored, what baseline it is measured against, and what the monitoring has found are things that the public record does not reveal. The absence of public disclosure about environmental conditions in the restricted zone, combined with the pattern of the broader documentary record, creates a reasonable basis for concern that the government's ongoing reluctance to open the island or to provide a full accounting of its history may be at least partly motivated by the discovery or the anticipation of environmental conditions that would be politically and legally damaging to disclose. This concern is not merely theoretical. The experience of communities in other parts of Canada that have been affected by Cold War-era military contamination is instructive. In several cases, communities living near contaminated military sites were not informed of the contamination for decades after it was first identified, and in some cases, ongoing restrictions on access to the affected areas were maintained in ways that prevented the communities from independently assessing the situation or seeking independent remediation. The pattern, when it has been fully documented, consistently reveals that the government's calculation prioritized limiting its own legal exposure over the affected communities' right to know about the environmental conditions of their traditional territories. The communities of the western James Bay coast have not had the opportunity to conduct independent environmental assessment of Akamiski Island. They have, through their community organizations and through the treaty and land claims processes, repeatedly sought access to the island for the purpose of such assessment, and these requests have been consistently declined or deferred. The argument that the communities should have the right to know the environmental condition of lands that are part of their traditional territory, lands that they have treaty rights to in the broader legal sense, is one that has been made with increasing sophistication through the legal and political channels available to them. The response from the government has been, across multiple administrations, that the matter is under review, that the complex situation requires further assessment, that the timing is not right for a change to the restriction status. The language of "not yet" is one that the communities of the James Bay region have heard in many contexts over the past century of their relationship with the Canadian government. It is the language that greeted demands for equitable education, for adequate housing, for clean drinking water, for fair implementation of treaty rights, for investigation of missing and murdered women, for action on the catastrophic rates of mental health crises in northern communities. In each of these contexts, not yet has functioned as a deferral that stretches across decades, a way of acknowledging a legitimate claim without making any commitment to address it. The not yet that greets demands for access to Akamiski Island and for a full accounting of the restriction's history is the same not yet, operating in the same tradition of managed deferral, with the same effect of shifting the cost of inaction onto the communities that can least afford to bear it. The political context for the restriction has changed significantly in recent years in ways that might be expected to create new pressure for resolution. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, issued in 2015, created a framework for addressing historical injustices affecting Indigenous peoples in Canada that has been accepted, at least rhetorically, by multiple federal administrations. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada endorsed and which has been given some degree of domestic legal effect through federal legislation, includes provisions regarding Indigenous peoples' rights to their traditional territories and resources that are directly relevant to the situation of the communities affected by the Akamiski restriction. The broader political culture in Canada has shifted, at least in its declared commitments, toward an acknowledgement of the harms done to Indigenous peoples through colonial policies and a commitment to addressing those harms through reconciliation. None of these developments has produced a resolution of the specific question of the Akamiski restriction. The restriction remains. The full documentation of what happened there remains classified or withheld. The communities affected have not received a public acknowledgement of the impact of the restriction on their rights and their culture, and the island itself, in whatever physical condition it is currently in, remains inaccessible to the people who have the strongest claim to be there. The gap between the declared commitments of reconciliation and the practical reality of the ongoing restriction is one of the clear illustrations of the distance between rhetorical acknowledgement of colonial injustice and actual redress of specific documented harms. The researchers and journalists who have worked most closely on the history of the Akamiski restriction are consistent in their assessment of what a genuine resolution would require. It would require the full declassification of the documents related to the restriction and its history, including the documents that have been withheld under national security exemptions that the available evidence suggests no longer reflect genuine security concerns. It would require an independent environmental assessment of conditions in the restricted zone, conducted in a manner that gives the affected communities a meaningful role and that makes the results publicly available. It would require a formal government acknowledgement of the impact of the restriction on the communities affected, including acknowledgement of the loss of land access, the disruption of cultural practices, and the intergenerational consequences of the restriction that have accumulated over 7 decades. And it would require a genuine process for negotiating the restoration of access in consultation with the affected communities in a manner that respects their rights and addresses the concerns that any legitimate, ongoing interest might generate. Whether any of these things will happen and on what timeline is something that no one who has followed this story for any length of time can predict with confidence. The history of similar situations does not provide strong grounds for optimism about the pace of resolution. The mechanisms that have produced acknowledgement and partial redress in other contexts have operated slowly and incompletely. The specific combination of ongoing classification, persistent environmental uncertainty, and legal liability concerns that characterize the Akamiski case creates particular obstacles to resolution, because full resolution would require the government to accept the consequences of full disclosure, and the government has been carefully managing those consequences for 7 decades. But there are also reasons to think that the current moment is different from previous moments in the history of this case, in ways that make resolution more likely than it has been before. The generation of elders who hold the most direct personal knowledge of the island and its meaning is aging, and the urgency of creating a record before that knowledge is lost has created new momentum behind the demands for access and disclosure. The legal frameworks for Indigenous land rights have strengthened significantly over the past 30 years, and the courts have shown a greater willingness to engage seriously with Indigenous rights claims. The political culture, while still imperfect, has shifted enough that the cost of being seen to continue deferring legitimate claims has increased. And the specific case of the Akamiski restriction, precisely because of its unusual longevity and the unusual completeness of the pattern of harm it represents, has become a kind of test case for the seriousness of reconciliation commitments that carries a symbolic weight beyond the specific communities directly affected. The island exists. It is out there beyond the horizon line visible from the western James Bay shore, carrying whatever history was made on it and in the waters around it through the decades of its restriction. The beluga still come to those waters in summer, in numbers much reduced from the past, but still significant, still following the patterns that brought the great summer hunts to the island shores for generations before the restriction was imposed. The tidal flats still expose and cover with the cycles of the bay. The coastal marshes still fill with birds in the migration seasons. The land is doing what land does, which is to persist, to maintain its ecological character across the disruptions that human decisions impose on it, to remain available for the relationships that the restriction has severed for 70 years. What the land cannot do, what no landscape can do, is wait indefinitely for the human relationships that give it meaning to be restored. The knowledge that makes a landscape knowable in the deepest sense, the accumulated understanding of its rhythms and its resources and its history and its significance, is a living thing that requires maintenance by the people who carry it. 7 decades of enforced absence have cost the communities of the James Bay region knowledge that cannot be fully recovered. Each decade that passes costs more. The question of whether the restriction will be lifted in time for the communities who have been separated from the island to return and begin the work of rebuilding what was severed is ultimately a question about the pace of justice. And justice, in the particular Canadian context of this story, has rarely moved faster than the people with power to compel it are comfortable with. The island in Hudson Bay that has been restricted since 1952 is not, in the end, a simple story about a military secret. It is a story about the relationships between governments and the people they govern, about the cost that national security decisions impose on communities that have no voice in making them, about the way that Cold War urgencies created situations whose full accounting was never made and whose legacy continues to shape the present. It is a story about land and about what land means to people whose relationship to it runs deeper than legal title or economic value. And it is a story about what happens when the mechanisms of accountability fail for long enough that the gap between what was done and what was acknowledged becomes so wide that bridging it requires a sustained act of political will that no government has yet found the courage to fully commit to. 7 decades, 1 island, no civilian has ever returned, and the people with the strongest right to be there are still waiting on the shore, watching the outline on the horizon, carrying the knowledge of what was taken and the question of whether it will ever be given back. That question is not rhetorical. It is a question that sits in the living memory of specific families, in the work of specific researchers, in the submissions of specific legal teams pressing through specific courts and negotiations, in the testimony of specific elders whose window for telling what they know is narrowing with each passing season. The answer to that question, whenever it comes, will say something definitive about the kind of country Canada has chosen to be. Whether that answer honors the weight of the question, whether it comes before the people most entitled to hear it have passed beyond the reach of any answer at all, is something that depends entirely on decisions that have not yet been made by people who have not yet found the resolve to make them. That, in the end, is what it means for a place to remain restricted, not simply that you cannot go there, but that the full weight of why you cannot, and what it cost, and what it is still costing, remains something that the people responsible have decided you are not yet allowed to know.